Okay. Thank you very much, and let me again greet everyone. We have with us here in Dominica the current chairman of the OECS authority, the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, Honorable Alan Chastanet, and also we have with him two of his senior ministers, the Minister for Education and the Minister for Economic Planning, here with us, and of course the Director General of the OECS Commission, and also Ambassador Gregoire and other delegation members from the St. Lucian delegation. It is just about 2 weeks and a half or thereabout, I accompanied the chairman to all of the islands affected by Hurricane Irma. So we traveled to Anguilla, to the British Virgin Islands, St. Kitts, and also Barbuda. We went to Antigua to speak with the authorities there. But who would have known that he would have been visiting me or visiting Dominica? And that is the harsh reality of the situation. And as I've always said to the people, today is this person's, tomorrow could be ours. But what this has shown is it has really demonstrated and exposed the true solidarity which exists in the OECS. Every single OECS government, every single OECS citizen, institution has been of exceptional support. They have been volunteering the support to us, and without them, we would not have made much progress in our response to this mammoth task of responding to this hurricane. I will not be long. I would like to invite to say a few words the Director General of the OECS Commission, Dr. Didicus Jules, who is well known here in Dominica, to speak to us on some of the initiatives which the OECS Commission has been working on since Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, PM, Chairman, members of Cabinet of St. Lucia and delegation, colleagues all, Ambassador Gregoire. Just want to give a brief synopsis. First of all, let me indicate that the Chairman is here at this time because there was a very deliberate decision taken immediately with the impact of Hurricane Maria in Dominica not to come in immediately, because we recognize the scale of the devastation and we felt that our best value to Dominica would be to remain in St. Lucia, in my case, pushing the effort to get as much aid in as quickly as possible, and in the Chairman's case, in consultation with other heads of the OECS, to work the international circuit, the UN Assembly, talking to the World Bank and other multilateral agencies to ensure that we were able to grease the flow of aid into the country as soon as possible. With respect to the work of the OECS Commission, there were 5 major areas of intervention. The first was the coordination of Venezuelan cooperation. As you know, we had 2 C-130 Hercules aircraft available to us in the OECS, and these first came in bringing in 40 tons of aid from Venezuela. There was a Cougar helicopter available that was based in St. Lucia. The Chairman agreed to pay for the fuel. The St. Lucia government paid for all of the fuel provided to these aircraft to do runs to Dominica, and in the case of the helicopter, there were daily runs into Dominica and satellite runs from Douglas Charles and Roseau into the affected communities to ensure delivery of supplies. A total of 40 tons of cargo and supplies were dropped, and 265 civilians assisted with evacuation by the Venezuelans during the period that they were at base in St. Lucia. It was also agreed that St. Lucia would be in collaboration with SEDIMA, that St. Lucia would be the logistical base for getting supplies in. Our role in this entire episode was to work closely with SEDIMA, recognizing the extent of the impact and the fact that SEDIMA had several other locations to address, that the OECS role in this would be to rally the non-impacted OECS member states on a basis of a sort of agreement, division of labor and support to provide continuous assistance to Dominica. So prior to Hurricane Maria hitting Dominica, the agreement was that Dominica and St. Lucia would specialize in the provision of water. So the water companies in both countries were asked to increase their production in order to supply Anguilla, BVI, and what was the other country? Anguilla, BVI. But we provided water to them. When Dominica became affected, it meant now that Grenada, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines now had to carry that load to ensure that food supplies were coming in. So there was both sea transportation, the use of barges, and sea transport bringing in supplies, as well as the use of the Venezuelan aircraft. At the OECS end, our pharmaceutical procurement service was also involved in the mobilization of medicine from our suppliers. So we had offers from many of our suppliers of medicine to bring it in. And a very specific service was provided in the case of Soufrière, because Ambassador Antoine of Grenada had gone into Soufrière on a Venezuelan drop and discovered that there were 200 elderly people in shelters who needed very specific medication for diabetes, insulin, and hypertension and other conditions. So the pharmaceutical service was able to shape a delivery of specific prescriptions for those persons, and we went back in and delivered them. The OECS was also involved in working on facilitating bilateral assistance on the request of Prime Minister Skerrit from specific OECS member states to Dominica, and I spoke about that in terms of the assistance that Grenada was able to bring St. Vincent and St. Lucia. The fourth area of intervention was our mission in Brussels, which has been exceedingly useful because they have a direct line to the EU. The EU headquarters is based in Brussels, and they were able to identify there's an agency of the EU that deals specifically with emergency and disaster situations called ECHO, and this is how we were able to get the water purification plant from Belgium, the government of Belgium, processing 80,000 liters per day. We got 50,000 water purification tablets and a quantity of cots, personal survival kits, and so on, some of which are still to come. So there's been a constant flow from Belgium, the UK, and a couple of the other EU countries. Lastly, our fifth area of intervention is just being a broker to help other disaster missions coming into Dominica. So the GIZ, which is a German support agency, was already working in Soufrière on a project, an environmental project, and because of that relationship with Soufrière, they wanted to focus their assistance there, so we were able to facilitate that. The St. Lucia Hotel and Tourism Association, the chairman had a meeting in the early hours of the impact of Maria on Dominica with the St. Lucian private sector, and urged them to play their part. The SLHTA decided to focus on the Kalinago territory, and several drops were made from that body. In the case of the Dominican diaspora, we had a lot of outreach from them, and right now you have working in mobile clinics and at the hospital a mission called the Dominica Medical Mission, which is headed by a Dominica National Sanita Scotland, who's a qualified nurse, and comprises at least, I think, 4 or 5 Dominican surgeons and highly qualified doctors who brought in totally self-sufficient. They brought in all of their medicines. They actually purchased $2,000 worth of fresh food from farmers in St. Lucia to bring in, so that in addition to the medical service they provide, they could help with hot meals with the patients that they service. In terms of going forward, now that we no longer have the Venezuelan means of transportation, we are beginning to shift our emphasis at the Commission from emergency response to recovery assistance. And you would have heard Mr. Peter Dillon, who's part of the delegation that came in with me yesterday. Already there's work happening with the planting of seeds so that we can supply seeds. We expect to help Dominica with the assistance of FAO and CADI, who's providing a lot of the seeds. By the time we leave today, there should be, I believe, about 16,000 seedlings already, planted in preparation. But working with the Ministry of Agriculture to ensure that within 4 to 6 weeks, Dominicans can start to reap their own crops, highly nutritious crops such as kale, tomatoes, cabbages, sweet potato, etc. We intend, by the way, to take this project also to BVI, to Anguilla, and to Barbuda, so that the road, we tie in that all into the strategic objectives of the OECS, because as you know, our food import bill is now at $750 billion US. Not even talking export, agricultural export. If we just get more control over our food import bill, this is how many millionaires we can make from not having to import $750 billion US. And trade in the OECS is only 1% of our overall trade. So this crisis has provided us with an opportunity to begin to do things differently, more trade among ourselves. And that is why the chairman has brought on his delegation people like Mr. Bryce from Bryce Company, who have given in the humanitarian phase, they provided building materials to Dominica free of cost. But now here's an opportunity in the recovery phase for us to use OECS businesses, OECS farmers, OECS entrepreneurs to work together with each other, create partnerships between Dominican businesses and OECS businesses, so we can create a new vitality of economic growth within the OECS as a whole. Lastly, we have started working the Commission on a vulnerability index, because we recognize that when you look at all of what is happening, vulnerability is the fundamental issue here, and we're defining vulnerability from many perspectives, and not just climatic and environmental, but economic vulnerability, health vulnerability because of threat of pandemics is real. So we are we're putting together a team of experts, including a professor who is internationally known from the University of Malta, who's a top expert in vulnerability in small states, in order to develop a vulnerability index that we hope will replace the formula of GDP. And this will be a mathematical index. We are going to use the experience of the hurricanes and disasters in the OECS that have happened to date to test the robustness of that mathematical formula, to show the impact of vulnerability on GDP, on growth, on sustainability going forward. So this is where we're at, and we stand continually ready to support Dominica in any way that the government and people of Dominica deem necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jules, for this update, and obviously we will require the Commission to continue holding our hands in the months and several years ahead. I would like to now invite our chairman, the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, Honorable Alan Chastanet, to share a few words with us. Thank you.
First of all, let me thank Prime Minister Skerrit for his gracious hospitality and that of his team. It was really a pleasure arriving this morning and being greeted by very well-dressed people. And I say that because maybe under normal circumstances that's not something that we would have noticed, but I knew it took a huge effort. And I want to say that on behalf of my team, how grateful we are for the hospitality and the respect that we've received here today. Prime Minister Skerrit talked about the trip that we had made up north. And I think that both of us were extremely shocked and taken aback by what we had seen. And clearly, the evidence that those countries, in many regards, were not prepared. The level of planning, the level of infrastructure, the capacity to be able to be resilient towards something that had happened to them was very apparent. What was also apparent in our discussions, and I want to thank Dr. Jules in particular from the OECS, about 2 days before Irma was going to hit the region, when we decided to meet and really to understand what the preparations that were being made, not necessarily those preparations on island, but those preparations as a region. And that if Irma had gone on the track that it was expected to have gone and would have hit Guadeloupe and Antigua and St. Kitts, that nobody really was preparing for the role that we would have to play in terms of evacuation and immediate support. So without the access of international airports, and knowing that Irma was going to be heading north to Puerto Rico and was also heading towards Miami, and Miami was already starting the process of shutting down, that the places that we would have traditionally have gotten support were not available to us. And so it was Dr. Jules and myself, along with the Prime Minister of CARICOM, with the lead chairman of CARICOM, which is Prime Minister Mitchell, along with Prime Minister Gonzalez and also Prime Minister Skerrit, that we started putting things in place prior to Irma's even arrival, and that letting the world know that we would be there and open up our doors. So notices to airlines were sent out, letting them know that they could come and land for free. Notices to the cruise industry that they could use our countries as evacuation points. And then doing a full inventory of our hotel rooms, a full inventory of cargo space, both at the airport and also the dock, so we could facilitate any kinds of evacuations that would have to take place. As the Prime Minister said, I did not know that we would have had to have kept our door open for so long, but certainly those things that we did augured well for Dominica, because even before the hurricane had hit Dominica, those same preparations had been put in place. In fact, the helicopter from Trinidad was already stationed in St. Lucia. The Venezuelan planes and also helicopters were on their way. And that we had a very good coordinated effort with Martinique. And I really want to thank the President of Martinique, Marie-Jean, for his assistance, dedication, and his empathy. It was his planes that flew over Dominica initially, and his helicopters that were able to give us our first reports about what had happened in Dominica, and facilitated the movement of cargo and of rescue services here to Dominica. I want to really bear witness to the strength of your Prime Minister. I think that what has happened here today would have broken a lesser man. And I'm extremely encouraged by his strength, his fortitude, and obviously his stamina. Because I've been through Hurricane Tomas. I know what it is to be working during the day, dealing with the government business, and dealing it with at a very high level in terms of pressure, and then having to leave here and go to your constituents. And as a Prime Minister, your constituents are the entire population. And so literally, you're on your feet all night to then have to return back to work here. So I don't want anybody to take what is taking place here for granted, in that the size of the problem and how do we deal with it. So as I've indicated in many interviews, there is 3 very real stages One is obviously on the initial phase dealing with the emergency, the humanitarian needs of water, food, taking care of people, and getting people to feel safe again. Then there is the cleanup process of now starting to give people hope again. And then the third part is the rebuilding of the nation. So as brothers that we've spoken about, the OECS countries, and I'm almost at liberty to say on behalf of the chairman of CARICOM, all of us, that we're all going to play a critical role in helping make sure that Dominica is back on its feet as quickly as possible. I'm asked a question and said, boy, you must be lucky that you were not hit. And I always say, yes, we were not physically hit, but the fact is we live in a very small ecosystem here in the Caribbean. And that when St. Martin, St. Thomas, St. Croix, Puerto Rico, BVI, Anguilla, Barbuda, and now Dominica are affected, then we're all affected. Like Dominica, St. Lucia has many nationals that live in the BVI and were earning incomes that they were sending back home. The farmers from Dominica who depended on those markets. And the same thing applies in St. Thomas and St. Martin and St. Croix. And it is because of our presence in those states that we have been pushing very hard to remind the United States, the British, the Dutch, and the French that we have every right to be sitting at the table and having a discussion as to what's going to happen in those countries. We have a vested interest in to see what's going to happen in those countries. And clearly this storm, or storms, and I call it the perfect storm, because not only did we have Irma, but we had Jose, and we had an earthquake in Mexico, and now you had Maria. It shows us how vulnerable we are, not only physically, but also economically, and that there are changes that we have to make, and that we continue looking north to the solutions of our problems, when in fact we have to be looking south. So Panama as a source, what Venezuela has done for Dominica and for Barbuda and Antigua has to be mentioned and has to be qualified, and we have to say thank you for what you've done. But that we also must recognize that we are all part of together, and we should not continuously be waiting for disasters to understand that. And all too often, maybe some of us leaders have to share some of the blame, that we keep on going to meetings and thinking that we're independent and acting independently. So I think that the OECS has been a greater example in the Caribbean of leaders that work together and that we're agreed to give up some of our own individual sovereignty to have things like a central bank, to have things like an economic secretariat. And so for our citizens who question sometimes the rationale as to why we spend money on having an OECS, it is days like today that the answer rings very clearly why we do. In terms of moving forward, we have a mammoth task ahead of us. I know many Dominicans have not been able to watch TV and to watch the cycle that has been taking place, and that it moved very quickly from Dominica to Puerto Rico, and then with this mass killing that took place in Las Vegas, that's now become the new issue. And that's the reality of the world that we live in, that it's very fast moving, and you have to try to take advantage of opportunities when they exist. And so the work of myself, of Prime Minister Gaston Brown, and I also want to thank Prime Minister Skerrit. I know how difficult it must have been for him to decide to leave Dominica to come to New York. And I want to say to Dominicans, it was well received. It was the right thing to do. And more importantly, that he took advantage of the time that he made in New York. The speech that he gave is a speech that we can all endorse. And I think that the way that he articulated the conflicts that we have in describing that this is a war zone and that we're in a war, and a war that we didn't start, And the war that he's talking about is the war of climate change. And so we're on the front line, and other people are making decisions for us, but yet we're being asked to bear the full brunt of that responsibility by ourselves. And I think there was no better time and no better person to have delivered that message at the UN. I think it's directly as a consequence of him being there and the impact of his speech that the Secretary General of the UN is going to be coming here this weekend. And I have to say to you, after driving through Dominica, that I have to feel, and I am actually assured, that he will be emotionally impacted by what he's going to see here. And the level of vulnerability and the level of helplessness that we all suffer from because of what is taking place, and the power of Mother Nature and what is left in its raft. And I believe that as a new Secretary General, I am convinced, and certainly in the discussions I had with him, that he will become a champion for our cause. And again, I'm sorry that it is the people of Dominica who've had to suffer to this extent in order for us to make that message known to everybody. But let's make sure that it's not in vain. We have important meetings up in Washington, D.C. next week. We've been able to now get a high-level meeting with the major countries in the world in hopes that we can get what we've been saying for years, that the Caribbean cannot be classified by one measurement when it comes to whether we're a middle income or high income or low income, but more importantly by one measurement to determine whether we should have access to aid money or have to pay for commercial debt. So we're hoping at that meeting that we've finally been able to convince everybody that the Caribbean and small states like ours need to be classified on a vulnerability index that the Secretary General was talking about. That would go a long ways in allowing us to help ourselves. Because I know one thing about us in the Caribbean, nobody's looking for a handout. All we want is a fair chance, a fair opportunity to be able to take care of ourselves and to prosper. And you know, when I come here and I see the extent of the damage, but I see people up and around, cutting wood, cleaning up their homes, and getting on with life, it makes me proud to say I am from the Caribbean. So Prime Minister, on behalf of all solutions, let me wish you all the best to continue to give the assurances that St. Lucia remains Dominica for the foreseeable future. Anybody coming to our country is like they're arriving in Dominica. And we will continue to be a hub, both for supplies and for people to support your growth and reestablishment. So again, I want to thank you for your hospitality. I want to thank you for your leadership.
There's nothing else we should say after the Prime Minister and Chairman has spoken. Thank you. God bless you.